All right, let's jump right into this. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to unpack some really fascinating concepts from a documentary called The System of Money. For centuries, the actual mechanics of our monetary system have basically been hiding in plain sight. We all use money every single day, right? Yet its true nature, how it's actually created, who really benefits from it, and what its ultimate purpose is often completely misunderstood by the general public. So today, we're going to dive into the source material to uncover exactly how money works and look at how the foundations of international dominance and national control are built on this hidden architecture.
To kick things off, I want to ask you a question that might actually seem a little too simple at first. Who actually creates the money sitting in your bank account right now? If you're like most people, you probably have this deeply ingrained assumption that the government just literally prints all our money. Or maybe you think that when a bank gives out a loan, they're simply lending out the savings that other responsible customers have deposited into the vault. Well, as the documentary points out, that's the story we're all told, but it turns out it's vastly disconnected from the reality of our modern financial system.
And the reality of that assumption is honestly pretty staggering. Get this, in the UK, back in 2010, a massive 97% of the entire money supply was made up of digital numbers created entirely by private commercial banks. 97%. That leaves a mere 3% as actual physical cash created by the government. So the vast overwhelming majority of what we use to buy groceries, pay our rent, and basically run the global economy is literally nothing more than electronic digits on a screen.
So there's this massive gap between what we believe and what's actually happening behind the scenes. Polling shows that nearly 90% of people completely misunderstand how banking works. The public myth is that you deposit your cash and the bank either locks it away safely in a vault or carefully lends that exact same cash to somebody else. But the reality, and the Bank of England itself actually confirms this, is that commercial banks literally create brand new money ex nihilo, meaning out of absolutely nothing. They do this every single time they issue a loan.
This out-of-nothing creation is the backbone of what the documentary calls the credit creation loop. It is super counterintuitive, so let's just walk through it step by step. Step 1, a customer requests a loan. Step 2, the bank doesn't go down to a vault to get cash. They just type digits into a computer system, boom. Step 3, brand new money instantly enters circulation. And then step 4, as that loan is repaid, that money is actually destroyed, and the bank just keeps the interest as profit. Because our money is created almost entirely through debt, if everyone somehow magically paid off all their debt tomorrow, it would theoretically destroy the entire money supply. We would literally have a moneyless economy. Wild, right?
So how exactly did we end up here? The source gives us some really vital historical context. Way back in 1844, the Peel Act in the UK restricted private banks from printing their own paper notes. The whole point was to give the state control over money creation. But the legislation completely missed digital demand deposits. It was this accidental, massive loophole that basically paved the way for banks to create electronic money. Fast forward to 1944, the Bretton Woods Agreement tied global currencies to the US dollar, which was backed by gold. But then, in 1971, President Nixon ended the gold standard entirely. And that right there marked the birth of our modern era. A true fiat system where money is completely unbacked by any physical commodity.
Just to wrap your head around the sheer scale of this, let's look at the decade right before the 2008 financial crisis. Over those 10 years, the UK Treasury created about 18 billion pounds of physical cash. And the profit from printing that cash, it went straight to the public purse. But over that exact same period, commercial banks created a colossal 1.2 trillion pounds of digital money. 1.2 trillion. It's the banks, not the public, that are reaping the enormous profits and bonuses from creating this digital credit, effectively expanding the nation's money supply completely on their own terms.
Which brings us to a massive number that really defines our modern landscape, 85.5%. The documentary highlights that, as of August 2011, 85.5% of all consumer bank lending was secured as mortgages on dwellings. Now, this isn't just some random statistic. It fundamentally shapes exactly how all this newly created digital money enters our economy, and in turn, dictates the very shape of our society.
So you might be wondering, why does so much money go straight into housing? Well, the documentary makes a really strong argument that banks naturally prefer safe, speculative investments. Think about it. If a bank lends to a small business, that's a productive investment. It creates jobs, creates goods, but it's high risk. If the business fails, the bank is out of luck. However, lending for a mortgage, that's a speculative investment and it's incredibly low risk. If you default, the bank just repossesses the house. Because of this,
Banks are heavily incentivized to pump endless credit into existing housing, which directly fuels massive asset bubbles.
To put that into perspective, the source draws this fascinating historical analogy to the Dutch tulip mania in the 1630s. This was basically the first recorded financial bubble, driven entirely by unchecked financial speculation. At the absolute peak of this craze, a single tulip bulb was trading for 10 times the average annual salary of a Dutch worker. The documentary uses this to highlight the absurdity of our modern housing market. It illustrates how, when you purposely funnel near-infinite bank credit into a single asset class like housing, it just naturally drives prices to these totally unsustainable, dizzying heights. But of course, this system comes with a massive, hidden cost. Inflating house prices might make people feel wealthier on paper, but it doesn't actually increase a nation's true GDP or output at all. Instead, it acts as a zero-sum game. It drives severe inflation and essentially functions as a regressive tax. It forces younger generations to take on substantially more debt just to put a roof over their heads. So what you get is an effective transfer of wealth straight from the young and the working class right upward to established property owners and the banking sector itself.
All right, so that covers the domestic side of things, but this explainer also looks at the bigger picture. How do these exact same mechanics, unchecked debt-based money creation, escalate into what the documentary describes as global financial warfare? How does all of this impact entire nations and shift the balance of international trade?
The answer lies in currency wars, or what's known as competitive devaluation. In a totally unbacked fiat system, exchange rates are determined chaotically by the market. So countries that are struggling with recessions will often deliberately try to lower the value of their own currency. Why do they do that? Because it makes their exports cheaper on the global market. But when everyone tries to do this at the same time, it just creates rampant instability. Keep in mind, a staggering $4 trillion are traded every single day in foreign exchange markets, and the vast majority of that is purely for speculation. It creates massive volatility that countries just have to constantly try to survive.
And when vulnerable nations inevitably fall victim to this volatility and rack up massive foreign debt, that's when international institutions step in. The documentary outlines a pretty strong critique of the International Monetary Fund, or IMF. It points out that when the IMF bails out a country, that assistance comes with some very strict conditions attached, known as structural adjustment programs. These mandate severe cuts to public spending, forced trade liberalization, and lower corporate taxes. The source argues that these policies effectively force developing nations to sacrifice their domestic growth and their sovereignty strictly to prioritize paying off foreign debt. They describe it as a form of modern financial colonialism.
Ultimately, the documentary builds to an absolutely crucial argument. Our debt-based monetary system essentially operates as a giant wealth extraction machine. On one side, you have the public. We pay the interest, we absorb the austerity cuts when things go wrong, and we deal with declining real wages because of inflation. On the other side, you have the financial sector. They collect the interest, they create the money supply for private profit, and crucially, they receive massive taxpayer bailouts because the government literally cannot allow them to fail without the entire money supply collapsing.
The documentary drives this point home with a darkly satirical segment they call the Adopt a Banker campaign. It's meant to highlight the profound absurdity of a system where everyday citizens, who are facing severe austerity and public service cuts, are forced to bail out a banking sector that then openly complains about reduced bonuses. In the segment, they mockingly ask the public to donate £395 to buy a banker's champagne, or £900 for new tires for their Aston Martin. It really perfectly captures the deep public frustration over socializing the risks while privatizing those incredible profits.
This whole complex dynamic is captured in a grim final warning from the source material. It says, "We can't grow the economy without growing the debt, and the debt is the very thing that will bring down the economy." Because all money is created as a loan that requires interest to be paid back, there is actually never enough money in the system to pay back both the principal and the interest, unless new loans are constantly created. It is an endless, vicious cycle where avoiding a recession basically demands creating even more unstable debt.
Which leaves us with this final, provocative thought to chew on today. Can a monetary system that strictly relies on constant, ever-expanding debt and the creation of money out of thin air by private institutions ever truly be sustainable in the long run? It's a huge question, and one that challenges the very fabric of our global economy. Hopefully this explainer has given you a much clearer view of the hidden mechanics behind the money in your wallet. Thanks for joining me today, and I'll see you next time as we continue to break down the complexities of our worlds.